When we finally wake up and become conscious of the world, we often find ourselves at a point of crisis. We find ourselves at a point of crisis because we realize the finitude of existence. We realize that there is tragedy, that there is sorrow in the world. And this tragedy and this sorrow plagues us. It wounds us. It causes us to feel pain, to feel fear. And so it's easy to lapse into a state of confusion, to not know what to do, to not understand how to proceed. And all of us, more or less, are walking along this path in life. Radical consciousness, which is to say, consciousness that sees through the culture that it is born into, is often no longer convinced by that culture. And so it finds itself at a point of crisis because it sees through the form of culture, the very form that was meant to integrate it, the very form that was meant to stabilize consciousness. This super insight that sees through and beyond culture is a plague that is the burden of the thinker. But it's not a position of absolute despair, because the ability to see through culture, so far from being a nihilism, so far from being a defeatism, is actually a kind of hope that is born in consciousness. What do I mean that it's a kind of hope that's born in consciousness? Because a super insight that can see through culture can also see the value that exists in culture, but it is not duped by it. It does not see this value mindlessly. So if it is to go after the gods, if it is born into a culture of the gods, it sees through these gods and understands that these gods are projections of the human mind, constructions of human imagination. But at the same time, it can see that these gods, that these deities have created meaning, have created hope, have even created community for mankind. But the super insight that sees and understands this is no longer condemned to the same form of culture that is unconscious about the culture that it practices. That is to say, when we see through culture and we can see that we are constructing it from our imagination, that we are collectively constructing culture, it's not that culture loses its meaning, it's that culture obtains a new value, a higher value. What is that value? That value is the capacity and ability to contextualize meaning itself. Because we are not duped by the form of culture. We can see the value of culture in relation to the raw experience of existence itself. And this allows us to discern where value lies. It allows us to discern how value is constructed in culture, as well as the kind of culture that has value within the context of existence. So what I call super insight, which is the ability to see through culture, even though it would seem to be that this insight draws us into a state of despair, of depression, that's actually not the case. That's what happens if we have a superficial penetration into a super insight beyond culture. But once we understand that super insight allows us to look back and contextualize the meaning that we have been partakers of, that we have constructed and created. The great hope is that we can now construct better, because we understand that the meaning that gave us so much hope, that gave us so much light, we understand that that meaning was always a constructed meaning. It was always a meaning that was generated not as a human being relates to an indifferent universe of trees and flowers and streams, but as humans integrated into community with each other. And it was this formation of community that allowed there to be the formation of existential meaning itself. So while we are deconstructing and feeling the despair of this deconstruction, we are also realizing the possibility of construction, that we can actually begin to build a better world, not on the basis of subconscious myth, not on the basis of merely being born into a culture mindlessly and adopting that myth, but by realizing that the myths of the cultures into which we were born were themselves constructed, and therefore we can construct even better, because we can do it intelligently. We can bring consciousness to bear. We can bring the context of the universe to bear on the formation of culture. I think that this is an important foundation, an axiomatic ground of an abundant and powerful humanism, that we begin to shape our cultures consciously, so far from feeling a great despair at the loss of culture, at the loss of myth. We get exactly the opposite, because we get a mastery over culture. We get a mastery over myth. We now can begin to discipline these forms, to use these forms in an intelligent way, in a conscious way, to construct a better world. It's very easy for the religious position to set out to create an atmosphere and a psychology of despair by claiming that the loss of a specific culture, that would be an idealist culture, that the loss of a specific culture, the loss of an idealist culture, must automatically lead us down a road of despair. But this is false. This is not true. This is a one-sided analysis of the situation. The truth is, the reality is, that when we continue to tarry with the critical thought, we're actually able to see that our greatest hope as a species lies not in mindlessly replicating the cultures into which we are born, but in creating new, more intelligent cultures that transcend the cultures into which we are born. This attempt to cast humanity down into a state of psychological despair and nihilism is one of the distasteful and despicable things inherent within the apologetic mechanisms of religion, as it seeks to retain an allegiance to its idealist forms. It seeks to frighten human psychology, to pull human psychology away from expanding these forms, away from the hope of transcending these forms. Think about it. The ancient civilizations of the past, we've seen their statues, we've seen their religions, we've seen their gods, and we can look back easily and say, these individuals were deluded. They believed in false gods. But the culture of our time, because it's contemporary, because we're born into it, we can't see this as easily. So instead of seeing through our gods, we end up worshiping our gods. But when we look into the past and we see the ancient cultures, we can see that the individuals of these societies were deceived. They were deluded by their cultures. Now, it's true that they were also sustained by their cultures. It's true that they also found meaning in their cultures. But consciousness, at this point in the stage of world history, has reached such an extraordinary advance in its awareness that we can now look back and we can understand the subjective psychological state from ancient cultures, and we can understand that we are guilty of replicating this exact same form, unconsciously within ourselves. We don't see through our gods. We end up worshiping our gods. But when we look at the civilizations of the past, we can see that they were deceived and duped by their gods. And if they were able to be conscious of this in their time, they would have obtained a higher emancipation. They would have been able to transcend, to sublate into a higher culture. And this is the position in which we find ourselves today. We find ourselves not in a position where we must worship the gods of our cultures, but in a position where our consciousness has transcended the gods of our cultures, which means that we can, as of effect, create greater cultural gods, greater cultural concepts. This means that they are more intelligent, they are more moral, they are more human in the highest sense. And so we look back and we see these ancient cultures and we think ourselves so vastly superior to them. But if we cannot transcend the cultures into which we are born, then we are no different than those ancient cultures that lived on the earth in the past. It is necessary, it is imperative that we see beyond the cultures into which we are born, not for the sake of becoming nihilists, not for the sake of casting human psychology into a state of despair, as regressive religion seeks to do even now to this day. But it is important that we see through these cultures so that we can construct higher cultures. This is the thing that matters. This is the thing that is important. This is the vitality. This is the inspiration. This is the great hope.